So hi, everyone. Welcome to the screening of Beyond Homelessness. My name is Steve Adami, and I am the director of the Reentry Division of the Adult Probation Department. I'm excited today to share with you some work that was led by Mary's team at the Independent Institute. Beyond Homelessness is a short documentary that was based off some research that they did, an independent study. For those of you who are familiar with our work at the Adult Probation Department, we've been leading reentry services since around 2010. In the last 18 months alone, with the support of Supervisor Safai, who's on this call, we have implemented 9 supportive transitional housing programs, all drug-free environments, and one is actually an abstinence-based therapeutic teaching community. All of our programs have been very successful, many of them led by Westside Community Services, who are on this call with us. And we're very supportive of this project that's being led by the Salvation Army. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who can talk about the documentary. We're then going to watch the short documentary, and my peer, Destiny Pletsch, will be leading a panel discussion with myself and Victoria Westbrook, all from the Adult Probation Department. So Mary, thank you for helping us organize this. It's nice to see everyone and excited to watch the film.
Thank you, Stephen. We're really so grateful for this opportunity to share this. As you mentioned, the film is the companion to a peer-reviewed study we produced on housing, homelessness, and importantly, solutions. It's meant to encourage conversations and brainstorming on innovative approaches that we can come up with in our communities to improve outcomes for all of the diverse individuals who are experiencing homelessness. I really look forward to, I think there's going to be a really interesting discussion following the screening. I'm going to start the film now. It's 38 minutes long, and then we'll come back and have a good chance to talk together.
San Francisco, the city by the sea.
California really was the Golden State when I arrived in the 70s. The streets of San Francisco were vibrant, free, and filled with hope. Now my beloved San Francisco has become known as ground zero for our nation's homelessness crisis.
Things are worse now for the homeless than ever.
San Franciscans have reached a tipping point.
After 40 years of failed approaches to reverse homelessness here, these once hopeful streets are filled with despair and brokenness. And until we tackle this problem, this will be our narrative.
There isn't enough drug treatment for everybody in the city.
What are you doing with all this money that has been allotted to the city? Where's that going?
So there's almost no development that anyone has a legal right to do in California.
We have pitted the smallest differences against each other.
You cannot arrest this issue away. You cannot arrest homelessness away.
Nobody is doing anything transformational.
Leaving people untreated is murder.
We're throwing vast resources at this issue, and it just keeps going up. Really, we can't come up with anything better than that? Beyond Homeless, Finding Hope is an exploration of what's driving the homelessness crisis here in California, and a look at alternative approaches around the country that offer hope with real solutions. Join us in changing the narrative of our nation's homelessness crisis.
Thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to introduce our panelist speakers today. We're really privileged to have Supervisor Safai, who's championed a number of recovery issues as of late. We have Mary Theroux, who produced this film, who is the Senior Vice President of the Independent Institute, Dr. Mary Ann Jones of Westside Community Services, Cedric Akbar of Westside Community Services and Positive Directions Equals Change, Major Matthew Madsen, a San Francisco native who has been with the Salvation Army for over 17 years. And for those of you who are on Twitter, you know him as @TWolfRecovery. We have Tom Wolf. I'd like to hand it over to Steve Adami to open up our panels.
Thank you, Destiny. I think we should start with maybe everyone could just give a brief intro of themselves, and let's go around. I think we should start with Supervisor Safai.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I'm honored to be here with such a great group of dedicated people to such an important issue. Mary, that was a wonderful film. Thank you for sharing that with us and actually giving us some hope, showing us an example of an urban area in the country that was able to take this issue head on, bring people together across the political divide. That's what I've been trying to do. I've been working for the past couple years on trying to put forward alternative ideas that have not necessarily always been embraced in San Francisco and move them forward in an aggressive manner. I think there's been some very lazy debates in San Francisco. People feel like you have to be on one side of an issue or another and can't see it from a holistic point of view. I think T. Wolf will tell you that better than anyone. Steve will tell you that better than anyone, you know, that it's not a one size fits all. You know, we're looking at real opportunities that, I mean, they talked about the cost of housing. We're trying to do legislation to streamline and increase the production. We think in one way that helps. But as you heard from a lot of the practitioners, housing is not the sole answer. And so we have to be real also about what it means to have additional shelter opportunities so we can just get people off the streets and stabilize them. But then at the end of the day, what was driven in this conversation about some real treatment and mental health services, we're trying to do that too. And we're trying to move it in a way that are models that haven't always necessarily been embraced in the city for a long time. Some of it being abstinence-based, and Steve will talk more about our therapeutic, our TRP, in partnership with Cedric and his team, Positive Directions, and their leadership on this issue. And then also the more recently just opened, and we pushed really hard for this, the Project Minna, which was both an abstinence, harm reduction, and mental health facility. So we're happy to have had conversations with Mr. Madsen from the Salvation Army and Theroux about the Urban Vision Alliance. I think that is going to be the path for our city to move forward and try to come up with a real holistic approach. So I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to learn from all of you and really try to tackle this problem head on in a real holistic and collaborative manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Cedric, you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Cedric Akbar, and I just always like to say that I love staying on the front lines, being close to what is happening in the streets. And what we see in the streets today is it's hurtful and it's harmful of what we see today. A lot of times we talk about the war that's going on over with Russia. We talk about people starving in other countries, and all of that is real. But at the same time, here in San Francisco, it appears that we have become anesthetized to what we see on the streets day to day, and therefore we do nothing about it. And it's a time has come where we need to address it, because we've been doing patchwork ways of doing it, but we need to come up with a comprehensive plan, and we all have to work together. And as Supervisor Safai said, is that this is not about being on one side of the fence or the other. These are human beings that are laying in the streets. And even when I look in this city, a lot of it comes from people not having enough resources to people of not even having day-to-day living. Because like when you look in San Francisco, like 39% of the people that are homeless are Caucasian and 37% is African-American, when we only make up 3% of the population. And that's very disproportionate. So those issues don't just lie on homelessness alone. The other side of this issue is what I see in the streets now. It's almost like the crack epidemic. It's like when African-Americans was in the street homeless, it was a criminal situation. Now that it's Caucasian people in the street, now all of a sudden it's a public health issue. So the thing is that we have to correct a lot. It's a lot of this that needs to be worked, but we also, even watching the film, and thank you, Mary, for the film, the people that are doing the solutions are still the same people. And I think it needs to be more inclusive of the environment that's out there, that's in them streets, And it needs to be more inclusive of people standing up and having a voice and participating, because it's going to take all of us. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Tom to introduce himself next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Wolf. I'm a recovery advocate. 4 years ago, right now, this very day, I was homeless on the streets of the Tenderloin, struggling with heroin addiction and fentanyl addiction. I'm now in recovery, and I advocate mainly on social media for sensible approaches to homelessness and drug policy. It's really important that we highlight the fact that addiction and untreated mental illness complicate the issue of homelessness. And until we come to that realization and understand that we need more treatment options, and we also need to work hard to break up what we call the open drug scenes on the street, to give people that are out there an actual chance at stabilization. We're never going to do it, especially with the advent of illicit fentanyl. It really has changed the game out there, so it requires us to change our approach. Thank you.
And speaking of stabilization, I would want to hand it over to Dr. Mary Ann Jones from Westside Community Services.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann from Westside Community Services, and I really think this is an important film that really highlights the overall issue and how this, one approach or one policy that we are following is not really addressing the issue that, we've known this for forever in behavioral health, that just solving homelessness and putting people in housing does not address, all of the issues that people are dealing with. And so I think that we do have to have new approaches, and we need to look at this through the lens of racial equity and social determinants of health, because these are all connected. People are, if we just look at one issue, we won't be really dealing with the whole person. And as evidenced by some of the outcomes that we're seeing, we're not addressing the real problem.
And Major Madsen, can you speak on your work that you're doing here in San Francisco?
Absolutely, absolutely. First of all, I want to say thank you, Mary and Independent Institute, for putting this together. We live in such a divided country and such a divided culture that we can't talk about anything. So just getting people to the table is a triumph of itself. And well, what the Salvation Army is doing here, we've been in town for almost 140 years here in San Francisco, and we've learned a thing or two along the way. Over that time, we've acquired properties here and there, and as you saw in the film, Theo Ellington was talking about some of our properties we're looking at redeveloping. In fact, last week we were interviewing architects. We've got all their firm information here. We're getting ready to get plans together so we can apply for SB 35 and look at really getting, putting a dent into this problem. And we realize that we are not the only ones out there. And if we can get everybody to the table, we can agree that, okay, Salvation Army, we're going to stay in this lane and we're going to do this because we've been doing it for a long time and we do a real good job with this. There's some other things we don't do so well. We're going to let you guys do that and you guys take care of this. And if we can all get on the same page, rather than playing tug of war against one another, we can start towing this thing to the finish line. And that's really what we want to be a part of, is an agent for change.
And Mary, you really elevated this issue. Do you want to introduce what kind of spurred this film? Sorry for jumping into a question already, but
no, that's fine. So I've been on the Salvation Army board for 20 some years. I'm the former chair. And about 4 years ago, the board and officers got together and did some strategic planning and identified that homelessness is really a place where we thought the Salvation Army could make a positive impact in the city. But as a policy person, I also realized that if the Salvation Army was going to have any success with a different approach than the status quo, we were going to really need to make a strong case, data-supported case that this is something that should be allowed, should be supported, and should be part of the mix. And so we produced a peer-reviewed policy report, and I'm sure many of us wonk out on policy reports and we love them. But we also realize that there are many people for whom policy reports just don't do it. And we really wanted to spur most importantly, really wanted to stir conversations at the neighborhood level, at the community level, at the city, county level, statewide level about, hey, here's some ideas. Can we use these, or can they prompt other ideas on how we can have much better outcomes than we've been having with the approach we've been using?
Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Steve to ask our first official question to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Destiny. In 2018, my team launched San Francisco's first recovery summit. And I find we were like the first group to really start talking about drugs. And I guess my question is open to the group. Why is San Francisco so hesitant to talk about the impact drugs have on people's lives? When I walk around the street, I do see poverty. I do see homelessness, but I see a lot of it driven by drug use. And I'm kind of curious if just putting somebody in a room solves the problem, or as I like to share with my team through our work, we're more interested in rebuilding somebody's life. Having a house is just part of that. Does the panel have any thoughts, insight of why San Francisco is so hesitant to address drugs?
I can chime in if you'd like. So from my experience dealing with politicians in San Francisco and activists and advocates, San Francisco is struggling with PTSD from the war on drugs. You'll hear that all the time. The war on drugs has failed. And everybody jumps to the conclusion that having any kind of collaborative cooperation with the criminal justice system equates to the war on drugs. And, if you look at like what European cities are doing, like Amsterdam is a great example, they found a formula in which their Department of Public Health and the police work together in collaboration to offer services, but to also break up open drug scenes, to have drug treatment. They offer harm reduction. They offer the whole spectrum. And here, we can't even get the Department of Public Health and the police to speak to each other in a room, let alone collaborate and work together. So that's part of the issue. And at the same time, we have let, there's been an evolution of drugs out there on this out that we see on the street now. The illicit drug supply has become synthetic. Everything's crystal meth. Everything is illicit fentanyl. Nobody on the street selling black tar heroin anymore. So that means that the cartels that are bringing those drugs in don't have to grow opium poppies and harvest them and make them into heroin anymore. They can just make everything in a lab, bring it up here and sell it. So that's increased the sheer volume of the drugs that are out there on the street. Combine that with the lethality of the drug being way stronger than your normal black tar heroin, and you've kind of fallen into this kind of perfect storm where we don't want to take any type of target specific law enforcement. At the same time, we're years behind in our treatment modalities and the development of drug treatment and the funding of drug treatment. And we've turned away from, things like collaborative courts to help compel people that are breaking the law into drug treatment programs to help them find recovery. And that doesn't work for everybody. No one's saying it has to work for everybody, but that option needs to be there because we need every single tool that's available to us to address this crisis, as it's completely spun out of control. And it almost seems like that our leaders, our elected leaders, many of them, not all, but many of them, were almost caught off guard by this crisis. So everyone seems to be playing catch up, and that's part of the reason why we're in the spot that we're in now.
If I could just add something, Steve, would that be okay? It's cultural, and we have to really shift the culture. San Francisco has a culture of sort of free loves, free drugs, and so on. And that's fine when we had very weak marijuana and so on. But I've sat in the room with advocates who look you in the eye and say, when you start talking about recovery, and we'll say, well, we believe these are adults who have a right to use drugs. And the problem is when you're dealing with things with fentanyl, that right is a death sentence, and we call it dying with your rights on. So we really have to address that cultural perception that drugs are somehow a choice, where increasingly, no, as Dr. Drew was talking about, these are drugs that are taking control of people's lives. They don't have a choice after a while, and they're prisoners to the drugs, and we need to liberate them. But we're going to have to start talking about it a whole different way.
And I think that the conversation in San Francisco, if anybody's been on the recent Board of Supervisors hearings, the conversation is on. It is a really critical time. And I think that a lot of folks in this space are elevating that message that we need to do more. But there is so much effort are existing in the city. We have Our City, Our Home. We have Mental Health SF that are on the pipeline to create these initiatives. And how do we disrupt the status quo? Because it seems like we're getting more of the same. That's my question to the panel. And I see Supervisor's hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, I think that, you know, there's a lot of people taking the conversation in different directions. It's kind of what I was referencing earlier on. There's a whole host of people as we've moved the conversation towards some options for abstinence. And I was one of the people at the Board of Supervisors to really elevate the issue, working with Steve Adami and adult probation. And rather than say truthfully that, you know, for some addictions, there is no medicine to remove people's addiction from that. There became a real defensive posture from the Department of Public Health and other places that said, you know, harm reduction in medicine to get people off of, or drugs to get people off of drugs was the only path. And I think for a lot of people that is a pattern that can work. But I also think that it's okay to elevate the conversation around abstinence. I also believe that, you know, as we've taken advantage of the opportunity to use the home key program and purchase hotels and transform them, that's one of the most cost-effective ways we've had to create more supportive housing and more shelters. And then, you know, we're going to have a big debate here at the Board of Supervisors in the next couple of months about a place for all, which will expand the opportunity to invest in shelter. And of course, I think everyone understands that the ultimate goal is to have for people their own place to live. But as Mary showed in her video and talked about in a lot of the movie, and you talk to a lot of the people that are professionals that have done this over and over again, you have to deal with some of the underlying causes. And I think mental health SF was a big step in that direction. We need to create more opportunities for people that will allow them a space to get well with their mental health and addictions first, and then we can begin. But you know, I am ultimately going to come down on the side of supporting a place for all, because I think that we need to get people off the streets first before we can begin to help them. But we need to be real open-eyed about dealing with people's addictions and mental health issues before we can then move them to permanent supportive housing.
Marianne?
And I think we really need to look at this dichotomy of abstinence-based versus, you know, harm reduction-based. Most of the city has harm reduction-based services, and we only have a few abstinence-based programs because of the way our funding restricts us from doing abstinence-based programming. But I think people have a right to enter a treatment program that meets their needs. And if the majority of programs are harm reduction, but people really want to be in an abstinence-based program, we should be making sure that we're providing those spaces at the same rate that people are requesting them. And so I think that is a sort of a dichotomy in our system that is has become like a policy issue, that you're either on this side or on that side. And really, we should be looking at the full array of what we can offer people that are dealing with addiction and meeting their needs, as opposed to us being just so stuck on, this is what I think is the best policy. You know, and talking with people who are successfully in recovery, I'll say a majority of them would say that abstinence-based programming was really important to them. Now, there may have been a time when the harm reduction work during their pre-contemplative stage, but to be able to go to a place that is abstinence-based, I think is an important, something that we really need to acknowledge and provide more of in our system.
If I could add just one thing to that. So, abstinence used to be one of the principles of harm reduction, and I'd like to think that it still is one of the principles of harm reduction. But, I've talked to people that are actively working in treatment programs in San Francisco, and they'll talk about things like, there are 17 million drug users in the United States, and none of them want to get clean, so we're better off in just supporting them indefinitely. And I'm of the ilk as someone that used drugs and had a very negative experience with drugs and illicit drug use, that just kind of prolongs the inevitable, that eventually there has to be a move towards recovery. And that's something that needs to be promoted, and it's actually not promoted and even denigrated in certain circles, not just here, but on social media nationally. There's a movement that kind of denigrates 12-step as an example as not being evidence-based, and they use that term very loosely. And and instead of looking at empirical evidence that shows that there's multiple different treatment modalities that are effective in helping people recover from addiction, and we need to use every single tool at our disposal. We had 103,000 overdose deaths in the United States last year. When is it going to be enough?
Then speaking of that, of which, as being a former user myself, I know one of the most important things I had to do when I was using drugs was to be able to support my habit. And how I'm gonna support my habit was gonna always be breaking the law. That was the best way I could support my habit. And like in response to what you were saying, Mary, about San Francisco being this open city and open market where it's okay to use drugs. Okay, it's okay to use drugs, but you have to support the habit. Also, when I use drugs and alcohol, I wind up being in front of somebody's sidewalk or being in front of somebody's door. And no kid in this city should have to be able to witness that or walk around that. Sidewalks, the streets belong to us all, and it should be used in a healthy way and environment. Now, one of the things that people we don't talk about is the accountability part. And what we have totally lost with all of this is accountability from the police, from the judges, from the court system, from the jail system, to our people that are in office, to even the programs. It is no hell no holding nobody accountable. What we do is hold hands, but we don't hold accountability. You can still show love and care with accountability. Sometimes telling people no is sometimes the best things in the world. Doesn't mean that you don't love them less. It just means no, not right now. Some things you just can't do. But we have created a place in society now where everything goes and you can't say anything to anyone if they're doing something that's out of line with the rest of everyone else. But we should never be able to be harming anyone. We shouldn't be hurting anyone when it comes to this. And one of the main things, like I said, is just to have the accountability throughout our system. And the other part about, speaking of which, what Tom was saying about the 12 steps program, one thing I know about getting sober. Sober, none of us on here can get any one of us sober. That is a spiritual thing to be able to get sober. And if it's spiritual, then the churches and whatever spiritual part of it needs to be included in this process also. But in the way this city works, you can't even begin to talk about nothing spiritual at all. So this is another part of what Dr. Jones was talking about also, of being more inclusive, of having the process of whatever this is going to take to move a person forward. I'm not saying this for everybody, but I do know this, that in order to get sober, it's a spiritual process. And we have no control over when that happens.
And I think that feeling that you can't tell somebody that they're doing something wrong is incredibly dismissive of that person, because your assumption is, well, they're not capable of following the rules that we civilized people can follow, or we superior people can follow. And also the thought, this dismissiveness that people aren't able to change, so we just have to support them where they are, is just so dismissive of the human person. And as we in the Salvation Army say, you know, God's creatures who deserve to be live to their full God-given potential. I also have a real problem with the concept of permanent supportive housing. It implies that there's no possibility of movement, that somebody can't live on their own, that they're going to need permanent support or have to live someplace permanently. I think we need to get away from that concept and talk about movement and transformation. And again, provide the array of, yes, the street is no place to get treated. The street is no place to be waiting to move on. We have to get everybody off of the street, but it doesn't have to be into condos and it doesn't have to be into expensive developments. There are a whole number of cost-effective places they can go, and give them the choice of to which they go, and then shut off the streets. You know, we have all these choices of where you can go to either use and sleep safely or to enter a program of this kind or this kind or this kind. But you cannot be in the streets. It's not good for you.
I'd like to jump in on what you said there, Mary. There really is a general assumption that individuals lack the ability to affect meaningful change in their own lives. And it kind of strips them from agency and it dispenses with personal accountability. And so it makes us ask the question, is the aim to assist them in getting back into the driver's seat of their own life? Or are we assigning them to a track? Are they going to be, is their life going to be like one of the BART lines? And this is the only place you can go. I don't see BART going too many side streets. This idea of permanent supportive housing, the word itself, it is very permanent. And so it feels like we're ripping away this long time life freedom because we're not willing to deal with the short-term addiction and the short-term problem. It takes asking the hard questions. And to get back to that question that Destiny asked earlier, I think in San Francisco, we don't like the uncomfortableness of asking tough questions. And sometimes we just need to do that. We need to ask the hard questions to get the good results.
Everybody has brought up permanent supportive housing and how the city is married to that solution for homelessness. But what I see often, or like predominantly, is that they provide housing, but they're not providing the supportive services that are actually needed to help somebody move and make changes in their lives. So what do you all see as like the primary needs that are not being met for our homeless populations, especially as it pertains to different cultures and different populations?
Well, first of all, there's a lack of treatment. Okay, so there's 500 treatment beds sanctioned by the Department of Public Health, and there's at least 25,000 drug users in San Francisco. So right off top, how can we offer people patient-centered treatment if we only have 500 beds? That doesn't make sense. The two concepts are like incompatible because we don't have the capacity to offer the diversity that's required to address the cultural needs of everybody that's seeking treatment. So that's one humongous issue that's underlying all of that. And while we focus on housing, and it's the federal model, okay, so this is the federal government that's focusing on the need for more housing. I understand that, but until we also place the same kind of commitment into expanding treatment and mental health services so we can offer that real diversity that's needed for all the different cultural differences, especially in a place like San Francisco, where you have, like Cedric was saying, you have, the African American community, the Black community, you have people from the Latino community. Somebody put it in the chat that there's no resources for the Latino community, hardly at all, for people struggling with addiction, right? How can we offer that patient-centered treatment if we only have 500 beds? And then the other 200 or 300 abstinence-based beds are in private programs that can't get any funding from the city or the state or the federal government because they're abstinence-based. It doesn't make any sense. And it's created this basically like a black hole where people just fall off the continuum of care because there's nothing for them out there because just the lack. And someone just said, Melanie just said in the chat, there's 0 residential beds for Mandarin, and Vietnamese speakers. So these are the things that we need to focus on instead of what they're doing right now, which is sticking people in hotels on 6th Street. And then the front desk worker is afraid to go up and do a wellness check on them. And they sit in their room for 7 days, and then they go up there and check, and they're dead from fentanyl. That's what's really going on right now, just so you all know. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question, and likely you'll answer it for me, Cedric? So Tom mentioned these 500 treatment beds, but having gone through the city and seen treatment programs and having paroled the treatment programs, the same treatment programs are at like 50 to 40% capacity. We have a large Latin community in San Francisco, and we have 9 beds at Latino Commission, 9. It nearly takes an act of Congress to get people in. So I guess my question back to the group is, do we have enough treatment beds, or do we have the right kind of treatment beds? Where if the state of California is licensing drug treatment facilities, and through that licensing mechanism, they're having requirements to become what they're deeming a licensed treatment facility. That doesn't give the local jurisdiction or local community to say, no, here's what we need to do to address addiction in our community, right? It's being dictated at the state and often the federal level. So to be a licensed drug treatment provider in the state of California, you must accept medication-assisted treatment. You don't have an option, or you can't get licensed. So when we work closely with the Black community through Cedric's leadership, their community and the data we gathered said, we want a safe place away from all drugs. And so we created this therapeutic teaching community because our premise is that drugs really weren't a drug addict's problem. Our problem is we had no idea how to live life. So we created a program in partnership with Cedric's team that really starts with basic concepts of assimilating into a program and learning how to communicate, learning how to get up in the morning and doing the right next thing. So my question to the group is, do we have enough treatment beds, or is it we just have the wrong kind of treatment? And what do we need to do to change that? And maybe Cedric and the supervisor can kind of weigh in on those things.
Well, one of the things I was going to say just before, of course, we don't have enough treatment beds, and I get to that part too. But one of the things that I have noticed about homelessness is when people come directly from the streets, it's a stabilization period that needs to happen. And part of that stabilization period, and what nobody talks about either, is medical health. Because when you have not been taking care of yourself medically, you definitely need to go to a doctor and see what is going on with the body, along with the mental health issues, and all of those other things need to be addressed before we can even start talking about addressing the substance use. People come from the streets with a lot of paranoia, not used to socializing with anyone, used to sleeping in doorways or being off to themselves, and their belongings, their things that they have with them become their comfort and security. And separating somebody from that is a process. And it's some people can do it with ease, but other people need the support of it to be able to do that before we can even start talking about treatment, because we have allowed this to go too far. And even once we get past this process, then of course, we need plenty of beds in San Francisco. We need those communities like Salvation Army have right now, a community that is set and conducive for people to be able to be welcome and wanted. And it's almost like a family approach to be able to have acceptance of the people coming in. Instead of we spend so much time having documentation about how a program runs. We spend 2-3 years doing that instead of putting the program in place. And what we need is, instead of 90% documentation, we need 90% help and support toward individuals. Because somewhere along the line is, we treating everybody like they're robots, and instead of treating people like human beings. And this is just like a mantra that we continue to go. But of course, we need way more beds in San Francisco, treatment beds, an array of treatment beds, and more focus on different communities so they can be able to support their own people, not somebody else dictating to them what their community needs, not putting our ways on them or putting America's ways or somebody who has money ways on them that don't even deal with those people. Those people have to bring their own culture up and bring up the way they need to bring it up. Because everyone here in San Francisco, if they're a citizen, then they're paying something toward the system. So they need to get it back and not being told what to do.
Cedric, I thank you for bringing that up. That's important. I think one of the things we need to address is motivation. When I was stationed up in the Salvation Army up in Denver, every year when the cold weather comes, and it gets darn cold in Denver, when the cold weather comes, it's interesting how many people want to get cleaned up. And a lot of people change, you know, it's minus 10 degrees outside. They realize this is not the life I want to live. Here in San Francisco, the weather's not nearly that bad, but you know, with all of these shelters and facilities that have just been purchased with this money, people are not uncomfortable enough to want to make those changes. And so it is very it's compassionate in some ways to get them off the streets, yes. But if they're not uncomfortable enough to want to make that change and do the hard thing, getting back to that theme again, then we're not going to see them move in that direction. And we need to see what we can do, because these folks, they deserve better than that. And we can come alongside them and really make a change. I do want to point out Theo Ellington, he mentioned the study that has been done within the Salvation Army. And he was talking about, you know, after a 6-month program, it's about a 10% chance of someone remaining clean and sober. But if we wrap around with 2 to 3 years of additional services and workforce development and life skills and really help them get those muscles back and start strengthening them and using them, it goes to 90%. I saw in the chat room, somebody was talking about, how are we going to fund this? I think the question should be, how are we not going to fund what we're talking about? Because if you're talking 1,000 beds and 90% of people per year, that's 900 people a year off the streets, 900 people the next year, 900 people, you start doing the math and that starts saving a ton of money. But we're not going to fill those beds if people are not uncomfortable enough to go seek them out.
Major, I think you hit a topic that we in the reentry team discuss all the time. Why would somebody want to change? We have to ask ourselves, I think everyone who's a provider, what is the motivation? And you described the culture that San Francisco, you know, so beautifully has in some ways, but it's also our Achilles heel. And I kind of just want to say, like, what is that in the absence of, you know, law enforcement? I just want to address it head on. In the absence of law enforcement, in a lot of cases, how do we, you know, what is that balance? What's that? We do have mental health teams that are patrolling the streets, but sometimes that doesn't feel like that's tangible in real time. So how do we balance those two realities?
I guess that's one of the issues is related to accountability. This is something that Cedric brought up, that we're so siloed in terms of homelessness and behavioral health and, you know, food insecurity. But how are we really assessing what works? I mean, we've worked closely with the Salvation Army for years because they have a program that works. We think that model works. But in this overall system, who's really measuring what's working and what's not working? Based on what I've seen, we look at whether or not a person gets placed somewhere for the night. That is a success. And the same thing in behavioral health is whether or not they get an assessment. But that's just the beginning of the journey. And I think that we need to look more at accountability and outcome-based programming that allows people to be able to access different types of services throughout the city that aren't just based in one ideology or another.
If I could add just 2 things really quick to that. So I agree with everything that Dr. Jones just said. So at the same time, you know, we talk about innovation. We talk about innovation around homelessness. We also need to talk about innovation around drug treatment. We have to come to the realization that the game has changed because the drugs have changed. We're not dealing with heroin anymore, guys. We're dealing with fentanyl, 10 to 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin. And you have to use it every 2 hours or you start getting dope sick. There's all these different things. So you know, when we talk about things like medically assisted treatment, that has to be part of the conversation. Even if it's short term, it has to be part of the conversation now for that particular drug, kind of like what they're doing at Minna Street. I really think that we all have to catch up, right? Those of us in the treatment world, drug policy world, everybody has to catch up and understand that the drug that we're talking about now really primarily is fentanyl, and we're talking about meth, right? There's no FDA approved drug to treat meth, but there is one for fentanyl. And we need to start having that conversation as a way to kickstart somebody into recovery, and then work through the phases of recovery to help that person eventually become free, right? That should still be one of the end goals, is becoming free of everything so that you can just move forward. And if that takes time, that's fine. It takes time, but we need to kind of come to that realization that we're dealing with new drugs that are way stronger, they're killing way more people. And until we come to that realization in the treatment world, we're not going to be able to kind of open up to that new innovation and new thought process. And it doesn't have to be all the way harm reduction. We can still have abstinence-based programs that entertain the idea of some type of medically assisted treatment along the way as a way to kickstart people into recovery. And it's because of the kind of drugs that we're dealing with, which is specifically fentanyl.
Supervisor?
Thank you. I just want to answer the question directly. I definitely think we need more treatment beds. We wanted to show the success with groups like Positive Directions Equal Change and adult probation as an alternative sentencing program. One of the things that hasn't been discussed today, and it's kind of discussed a bit, is that so many of the individuals that we're talking about are in and out of prison. They're very much recidivists. They're very much repeat offenders. I'm saying the same thing multiple times, but I'm trying to be emphatic. So that's why we were so happy to partner with adult probation. And I've had a number of people, since we've done 2 of these projects together, say, man, adult probation is the one that's really doing innovative things for the city. Why isn't DPH? Why aren't some of these other places doing some of this innovative work? And I think there is innovative work in DPH and other parts of the city, but we need more options to balance this out. And so we're going to push. I think we need probably somewhere between 500 and 1,000 of these types of beds in the city, based on the 70% of the people that were recidivists had an underlying drug or alcohol addiction issue. Many of them also have mental health issues. So I'm going to continue to push that. And then there's another question in the chat that says, looking at the Haven for Hope model. I mean, I think that's what a lot of this conversation is about today, how we can take models like that and replicate them, working with people like the Salvation Army and others to see how we can put together a comprehensive plan, break down the barriers. And so I hope to be that champion. I hope to continue to move this conversation forward. I'm happy to work with anyone here today and in the room. And we're going to be aggressive about moving an agenda forward that's about really addressing the root causes of this and not trying to ignore the problem. I also think we have opportunities outside of the city and county of San Francisco. I think we need to use that. When we were talking about medically assisted locked facility for seniors, there's about 40 of those beds that we have, and they're down in the South Bay. So we also have to be real about having options that are outside of the city, because that's where we're going to get additional treatment as well. So just want to be on record for that and say I really appreciate being part of this conversation today. Well, you all are the experts. You all are the experts. I'm just a conduit for your ideas.
Well, you've been an amazing advocate and ally, and I will say that it's been fantastic working with you, and we are always excited on new projects that we have coming up. You know, we're wrapping up. It's around 3:30 right now. I was wondering if anyone in the chat had any last-minute questions they wanted to ask the panelists. If not, I'm going to turn it over to Mary for some closing comments and next steps about the work with the Major Madsen, and the Salvation Army, and Theo when he returns.
Thank you, Steve, and thank all of you. This has just been a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation. We could talk for several more hours. There's lots and lots of, we've touched on a lot of things here that need to be delved into deeper. Before COVID, when the Salvation Army embarked on this planning, we were having really good meetings with people across agencies and representatives from the mayor's office and fire, police, et cetera, to first get to know each other and then talk about how we could come together to row in the same direction strategically to attack this. And I think that's really the most helpful thing that we can be working on a go forward basis. And Safai, however you can help us again, break down the silos and get into one conversation with everyone involved and talk about positive, a positive array. So it's not a, win-lose, it's a everybody wins, because we all want the same thing. We all want to help the human beings about whom we're talking. So that's I think, really key is to just have more conversations that are more inclusive with everybody and start really making strategic plans with real goals, with real strategies, with real, as Dr. Jones pointed out, real accountability, outcomes-based accountability. So I'm very excited. There's a lot more openness to different approaches than there was even 2 years ago when we started talking about this. And I think we're gonna get ourselves, our friends and our neighbors taken care of and have a wonderful city again that we can all be proud of. So thank you all for being a part of that change.
Any last minute remarks?
If people want to see the film again, it is available on our website, beyondhomeless.org. You just go under documentary and you can watch it and share it with other people. But again, it's meant to be a conversation starter, not for somebody watch on their own and whatever. So.
Steve, I'd like to just share briefly. There's a project that we've been working on in concert with the city and with PRC Baker Places in the Mission. 1156 Valencia is the address. It's a place the Salvation Army has owned for many, many years. And we kind of retrofitted it and are working with Baker's Places to make this a pre-contemplative mental health respite center for folks to come right off the street, kind of clear their minds up and figure out what they need to do. And from there, then they can go into different recovery programs. It's a beautiful, beautiful program. We need more things like that, because it's not just the issues like, Tom, you're hitting it hard on the fentanyl, and that's true. That is a massive issue. But I think we all know dual diagnosis is huge. There's so many that's dual diagnosed, so we need to be hitting it on both cylinders. And it's great to see these partnerships. When we all work together, it just is so much stronger. It's a much better product in the end. I think it's clear. The more we get to see that this city has the motivation to do the right thing, we have the money to do the right thing, we have the methods to do the right thing. The question is, do we have the moxie to get over whatever biases we may have and get to work?
Thank you, Major. Appreciate it. Again, thanks everyone who attended today. It was great having this open conversation. Supervisor Safai?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I want to really thank Mary for such a wonderful film, and it leaves me with a lot of hope. I know the Urban Vision Alliance, the people coming together here in San Francisco, we need leadership from the top. We need leadership on the citywide level. We need to prod and push and talk with the mayor. And if this, whoever is in that position, we have to be able to convince leadership of the city to move this kind of vision forward. So I'm very hopeful and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Supervisor. Cedric, Victoria, Tom, Supervisor Safai, Major Madsen, Mary Ann, Destiny, and Mary Theroux. Thank you very much for joining us today and your input. This will also be posted on the CASC website, so we will get a copy of this recording. And a special thanks to Supervisor Safai. I just have to say one more time, it has just been amazing what we've done together in the last 9 months. And I'm so grateful, and our partners are grateful that you took positions publicly that weren't popular. But we show that our commitment to people and valuing that people can change really is where our investment should be at. And I just want to say thank you personally from my heart to yours. So everyone, it's been amazing. And until the next time, have a great day.
Thank you all.